The year is 1740. The British Royal Navy is the most powerful maritime force on Earth. Its ships dominate trade routes from the Caribbean to the Pacific. Its officers carry the ambitions of an empire. Its sailors carry something else, something no one fully understands yet. Their gums are black. Their teeth are falling out. Their skin, once tanned and weathered from years at sea, has turned a deep, mottled purple, covered in hemorrhages that spread like ink through paper. They are dying. And no one can explain why. Historical records from the 1740 Anson Expedition, one of the most catastrophic naval voyages in British history, suggest that of the approximately 1,900 men who departed England, fewer than 500 returned. Many did not die in battle. They did not die in storms. They died of a disease that had plagued sailors for centuries, a disease so well documented, so widely feared, and so completely misunderstood that it had become simply accepted. They called it scurvy. This is not a story about a disease. This is a story about a man who found the answer, and was ignored. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world in which it happened. The 18th century was the age of maritime empire. Britain's wealth, its trade, its colonies, its global influence, depended entirely on the sea. Ships carried sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the East Indies, silver from the Americas. They also carried men. Thousands of men. Men who spent months, sometimes years, far from land. At sea, fresh food was impossible to preserve. Sailors ate salt pork, dried biscuits, and dried legumes. They drank water stored in barrels that quickly turned foul, supplemented by beer and rum. Fresh vegetables and fruit were luxuries that existed only in port, and ports could be months apart. By the early 18th century, naval surgeons had recorded scurvy with terrifying consistency. The symptoms followed a predictable pattern. First, fatigue. A heaviness in the limbs that sailors initially dismissed as the ordinary exhaustion of life at sea. Then, within weeks, the gums would soften and swell. Teeth would loosen. Old wounds, wounds that had healed years before, would open again, as if the body were retracing its own injuries in reverse. The skin would hemorrhage. Joints would swell. Bones would ache. And eventually, the heart would fail. Estimates from historians suggest that between 1500 and 1800, scurvy may have killed more than 2 million sailors. More than all naval battles, storms, and shipwrecks combined. It was, by any measure, the single greatest threat to maritime civilization. And yet, the cause remained entirely unknown. The dominant theory of the era, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and reinforced by centuries of tradition, was the concept of miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air, by corrupted vapors rising from rotting matter. Scurvy, according to most physicians of the time, was caused by the damp, cold air of the ocean, by the physical exertion of sailing, by the melancholy brought on by long voyages far from home. Some physicians proposed acid-forming foods as the culprit. Others blamed the salt in preserved meats. A few suggested that the cold temperatures of northern waters weakened the body's vital forces. None of them were right. And the price of being wrong was measured in lives. James Lind was born in Edinburgh in 1716, the son of a merchant family with modest means and considerable ambitions. He began his medical career not in a lecture hall, but at sea, apprenticed as a surgeon's mate in the Royal Navy at the age of 15. For 9 years, he served on naval vessels across the Atlantic and Mediterranean, watching the disease kill men around him with mechanical regularity. What distinguished Lind from his contemporaries was not genius in the romantic sense, not a sudden, lightning bolt insight. What distinguished him was something quieter, and in many ways more powerful, a willingness to observe carefully, and to follow the evidence wherever it led. By 1747, Lind was serving as surgeon aboard HMS Salisbury. It was there, in the spring of that year, that he conducted what historians of medicine now consider one of the most significant experiments in the history of clinical science. He had 12 patients, 12 sailors, all suffering from scurvy, all in roughly similar condition. He divided them into 6 pairs. Each pair received a different treatment, administered daily. The first pair received a quart of cider per day. The second received 25 drops of elixir of vitriol, a diluted sulfuric acid solution, then fashionable as a medical treatment. The third received 2 spoonfuls of vinegar, 3 times a day. The fourth received half a pint of seawater daily. The fifth received a mixture of garlic, mustard seed, horseradish, and tree bark, a compound based on the miasma theory, designed to purify the body. And the sixth pair, the last 2 men, received 2 oranges and 1 lemon every day. Within 6 days, the results were unambiguous. The 2 sailors receiving citrus fruit had recovered. One returned to full duty. The other, still weak, was well enough to serve as nurse to the remaining 10 patients, all of whom remained sick. Lind had not just found a treatment. He had conducted the first controlled clinical trial in the history of Western medicine. According to surviving documents, Lind was careful in his conclusions. He did not claim to have discovered the cause of scurvy. He claimed only that the evidence clearly demonstrated the curative effect of citrus fruit, and that this finding warranted serious attention from the medical establishment. In 1753, he published his findings in a book titled A Treatise of the Scurvy. He had no way of knowing what would happen next. A Treatise of the Scurvy was published in 1753. It was read. It was discussed. And then, with a slowness that would cost thousands of lives, it was set aside. The response from the medical establishment was not hostile. It was something worse. It was indifferent. Some physicians acknowledged Lind's experiment as interesting. Others questioned his methodology. The sample size, 12 men, was, by their standards, too small to draw meaningful conclusions. The experiment had not been replicated. And the theoretical framework Lind offered was, to most contemporary physicians, unconvincing. The problem was not simply one of bureaucracy or institutional resistance, though both played a role. The deeper problem was conceptual. In the 18th century, medicine did not yet possess the vocabulary or the framework to understand what Lind had actually found. The idea that a disease could be caused by the absence of something, rather than the presence of a pathogen, a toxin, or a corrupting vapor, was genuinely foreign to the medical thinking of the era. Physicians looked for causes. Lind had identified a cure. But without a cause, the cure seemed like coincidence. Within the Royal Navy itself, the barriers were institutional. Citrus fruit was expensive. Logistics at sea were extraordinarily difficult. Provisioning ships with fresh lemons and oranges on long voyages would require significant changes to naval supply chains, changes that no single experiment, however well conducted, could easily justify to admirals and administrators focused on the costs of war. There was also the problem of competing theories. Lind himself was not fully certain why citrus fruit worked. He speculated about the acid in the juice, and even recommended that the juice be boiled down into a concentrate for easier storage, a process that, as later science would confirm, destroyed most of the active compound responsible for its effectiveness. This confusion made it easier for skeptics to dismiss his findings. James Lind spent the next 4 decades at the Royal Naval Hospital in Haslar, one of the largest hospitals in the world at the time. He continued to publish. He continued to advocate for the practical application of his findings. He wrote extensively on naval hygiene and the prevention of disease at sea. He was respected. He was cited. He was not listened to. James Lind died in 1794, at the age of 78. He did not live to see his discovery put into practice. 21 years after Lind's experiment. 15 years after his treatise was published. The HMB Endeavour, under the command of Captain James Cook, departs England on a voyage of scientific exploration and imperial ambition. Cook carries with him a determination to protect his crew from the disease that had devastated so many previous voyages. He carries sauerkraut, wort of malt, and portable broth, the Admiralty's approved anti-scorbutics. He does not carry Lind's recommended citrus juice in consistent, reliable quantities. Cook's first voyage, lasting 3 years, was, by the standards of the era, remarkably successful in limiting scurvy deaths. But the methods he used were inconsistent and their effectiveness was partial. On subsequent voyages, Scurvy continued to appear. The historical record from the decades between 1753 and 1795, the years between Lynd's publication and the Royal Navy's eventual adoption of lemon juice, is a catalogue of preventable death. Some historians estimate that during this period, the Royal Navy alone lost tens of thousands of men to scurvy. Exact figures are difficult to establish. Naval records of the era were incomplete, and deaths at sea were frequently attributed to a range of causes, but surviving muster rolls and ship's logs document the scale of the catastrophe with numbing regularity. Consider the numbers. In a single year of major naval operations during the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 1760s, the Royal Navy is estimated to have lost more men to disease, scurvy chief among them, than to enemy action. According to historical records, during the American Revolutionary War in the 1770s, the ratio of disease deaths to combat deaths in the British Navy was, by some estimates, more than 5 to 1. These were not abstract statistics. They were men. Sailors from coastal towns in Cornwall and Kent. Fishermen's sons from Scotland. Boys who had signed on for adventure and found themselves dying in their hammocks, their bodies betraying them in ways no one could yet explain. And through all of it, through every voyage, every muster roll, every burial at sea, the answer sat in a published book in Edinburgh. 2 oranges. 1 lemon. Sir Gilbert Blane was, in many ways, everything James Lind had not been. Where Lind was a careful, methodical clinician working at the margins of the naval establishment, Blane was connected, politically, socially, institutionally. He was physician to Admiral Rodney's fleet in the West Indies in the early 1780s. He had the ear of men who made decisions. Blane had read Lind. He had observed scurvy first-hand aboard naval vessels. And unlike the generations of administrators and physicians who had come before him, he was positioned to do something about it. 4 years, he collected data. He tracked mortality rates. He documented the relationship between provisioning practices and disease incidents with the systematic precision of a man who understood that abstract arguments rarely moved institutions, but numbers sometimes did. In 1795, 42 years after Lind published his treatise, the Royal Navy officially adopted the policy of issuing daily rations of lemon juice to all sailors on extended voyages. The policy was implemented with remarkable speed once the decision was made. And the results were almost immediate. According to historical records, scurvy cases in the Royal Navy dropped dramatically within years of the policy's implementation. Ships that had previously seen dozens of cases on long voyages now reported almost none. The disease that had claimed more sailors than warfare, storms, and shipwrecks combined was, essentially, eliminated from the Royal Navy. Not by a new drug, not by a medical breakthrough, but by 2 spoonfuls of lemon juice a day. 10 years after lemon juice became standard naval issue, Admiral Nelson's fleet met the combined French and Spanish navies off the coast of Cape Trafalgar. The British victory that followed, one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, was achieved, in part, by a fleet that was healthy. Healthy enough to fight. Some historians believe, with the cautious hedging that good history requires, that the dietary policy championed by Blane, built on the foundations of Lind's ignored experiment, may have contributed to Britain's naval dominance during the Napoleonic Wars. The men were healthy. Lind had known how to make them healthy in 1747. Gilbert Blane, who implemented the lemon juice policy, received a knighthood and considerable historical recognition. His name appears in the naval histories of the Napoleonic era. He is rightly credited with saving thousands of lives. James Lind, who had the answer 42 years earlier, faded. This is not unusual in the history of science. The pattern of discovery, rejection, and eventual vindication repeats with uncomfortable regularity. The physicians who initially rejected the germ theory of disease. The geologist who proposed continental drift and was laughed out of conference rooms. The physician who noticed that surgeons who washed their hands before delivering babies saved more lives, and was institutionally destroyed for suggesting it. Lind belongs to this company. In 1932, nearly 185 years after Lind's experiment on HMS Salisbury, a Hungarian biochemist named Albert St. Georgi isolated a compound from adrenal gland tissue that he initially called hexuronic acid. Working independently and nearly simultaneously, American researcher Charles Glenn King confirmed that this compound, which would be renamed ascorbic acid, or vitamin C, was the substance that prevented and cured scurvy. What Lind had found empirically in 1747 was now understood biochemically. Scurvy was not caused by bad air, not by corrupted vapors, not by the physical exertion of life at sea. It was caused by the absence of ascorbic acid, a compound the human body cannot synthesize on its own, which must be obtained through diet. Without it, the body cannot produce collagen, the structural protein essential to maintaining connective tissue, skin, blood vessels, and bone. Old wounds reopen because the collagen holding them together degrades. Teeth fall out because the tissue anchoring them breaks down. Internal hemorrhages spread because the vessels containing the blood cannot hold. 2 oranges, 1 lemon, each containing enough ascorbic acid to keep a sailor's collagen synthesis functioning for days. Lind had found the answer through careful observation of 12 men on a ship in the English Channel. He never knew why it worked. He knew that it did, and that, for half a century, was not enough. Albert St. George received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1937, in part for his work on vitamin C. There is a question that sits beneath this story, one that historians of medicine have returned to repeatedly, and that has no clean or comfortable answer. How do we calculate the cost of ignored knowledge? Between 1753 and 1795, conservative historical estimates suggest that tens of thousands of sailors died of a disease that was curable. Not in theory. Not in some distant future when the biochemistry would be understood. Curable in practice, with a treatment that had been demonstrated in a controlled experiment and published in a widely available medical text. The reasons for the delay were real and, in isolation, each one is understandable. The sample size was small. The theoretical framework was absent. The logistics were difficult. The institutional mechanisms for translating clinical findings into naval policy were slow and bureaucratic. The competing theories created genuine uncertainty. And yet, thousands of men died. The historian's job is not to assign blame across centuries to men working within the limitations of their time and knowledge. That would be neither fair nor useful. But the historian's job, and perhaps the documentarian's job, is to hold these stories up to the light and ask what they reveal. They reveal that institutions resist change, that theoretical frameworks outlive their usefulness, that the distance between knowing something and acting on it can be measured, sometimes, in lives. Albert St. George, who would eventually complete what Lind began, once said something that historians have quoted with both admiration and sorrow. He observed that discovery consists of seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. Lind saw what everybody had seen: 6 sailors, citrus fruit, recovery. He thought what nobody, at the time, was willing to fully accept. The question that remains, and that every generation inherits from the one before, is not whether there are answers sitting in plain sight that we are choosing to ignore. The question is which ones.